The ballroom erupted in laughter the moment the auction screen displayed the listing: a fading seaside resort purchased for just $12,000 by a struggling single dad. Investors exchanged amused glances. Reporters scribbled notes. And standing at the center of it all was billionaire hotel magnate Victor Hale, who grabbed the microphone and publicly mocked the purchase as the worst investment of the decade. Across the room stood Ethan Carter, a single father raising his daughter alone, holding the keys to the resort everyone called worthless. The property had broken utilities, empty rooms, and years of losses behind it. Even local banks had refused to touch it. But Ethan wasn't staring at the crowd. He was staring at an old map hidden inside the resort's original records, a map connected to something nobody had noticed for decades. 6 months later, the same billionaire would desperately try to buy the property back. The question was, what did Ethan discover that turned a forgotten resort into a $45 million empire? The laughter echoed through the ballroom long after the auction screen switched to the next property. Ethan Carter stood near the back of the room, gripping a worn folder against his chest while dozens of investors whispered and smirked. Some openly shook their heads. Others pulled out their phones, already sharing photos of the auction's biggest joke. The resort he had just purchased sat on 30 acres of neglected coastline. Half the guest rooms had been closed for years. The restaurant hadn't served a customer in nearly 18 months. According to the reports, the electrical system barely functioned, and several structures needed immediate repairs. To everyone else, it was a disaster. To Ethan, it was the only opportunity he could afford. Across the room, billionaire hotel owner Victor Hale accepted congratulations from a circle of executives. His expensive suit and confident smile seemed to command everyone's attention. Then Victor raised his glass. "Here's to the brave man who just spent $12,000 on a property worth less than the paperwork it came with." The crowd erupted again. A few people glanced toward Ethan. Others laughed even harder. Ethan forced a smile, refusing to react. Beside him stood his 12-year-old daughter, Lily. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with concern. "Dad," she whispered, "are they right?" The question hurt more than the laughter. For a moment, Ethan looked toward the giant screen displaying an image of the faded resort. Peeling paint covered the main building. Empty balconies overlooked a beach few tourists even knew existed anymore. Every fact said he had made a terrible decision. But something inside him refused to believe it. He knelt beside Lily. "I don't know what happens next," he said quietly. "But I know one thing." "What?" "We're not giving up before we even start." Lily smiled faintly. It wasn't confidence. It was trust. And Ethan knew he couldn't let her down. Hours later, after the auction ended and the crowd disappeared, Ethan unlocked the front door of the abandoned resort for the very first time. Inside the manager's office, buried beneath decades of dust, he noticed an old leather ledger lying partially hidden behind a cabinet. As he opened it, a folded piece of yellowed paper slipped onto the floor. Ethan bent down and picked up the paper carefully. The edges were brittle with age, and the ink had faded into a pale brown. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than an old sketch. But as he unfolded it completely, he realized it was a hand-drawn map of the resort grounds. Several locations had been circled in red pencil. One of them was marked with a single word: "Closed." Another was labeled "Original Access." There were no explanations. No signatures. No dates. Just mysterious markings scattered across the property. Lily leaned over his shoulder. "What is it?" "I honestly don't know." For a moment, they stared at the map together while the empty office remained silent around them. The next morning, reality returned fast. The resort was in worse condition than Ethan had imagined. Broken windows overlooked abandoned walkways. Rust-covered railings near the beach. The swimming pool contained more weeds than water. Every contractor he contacted delivered the same message: repairs would cost far more than the purchase price. By the end of the week, his savings account had shrunk dramatically. Some suppliers demanded payment up front. Others refused to work on the property at all. Meanwhile, local residents seemed amused by his efforts. Whenever Ethan stopped for coffee in town, someone inevitably asked how the $1 million resort was doing. The jokes never stopped. Even local newspapers published articles questioning why anyone would buy such a hopeless property. Yet every evening, after Lily finished her homework, they returned to the map. The strange markings continued bothering him. Why would someone carefully draw these locations? And why hide the map inside an old ledger? On the 8th day, Ethan decided to investigate the first marked area. The location led them to a section of the property far behind the main buildings. Thick vegetation covered most of the pathway. Trees and vines had swallowed what appeared to be an old stone walkway. After nearly an hour of clearing brush, they discovered something unexpected: a large metal gate. The gate was heavily rusted and chained shut. A weathered sign still hung from one side. The lettering had nearly disappeared, but a few words remained visible. Authorized access only? Lily stared at it. Why would there be a gateway out here? Ethan didn't have an answer. The area wasn't shown on any modern property records he had received during the purchase. As they examined the gate, he noticed something else. The chain locking it wasn't nearly as old as the surrounding structure. Someone had secured it long after the resort was abandoned. Someone had wanted people to stay out. And suddenly, the strange map felt much more important than either of them had imagined. The discovery of the gate stayed in Ethan's mind all night. It wasn't just the gate itself that bothered him. It was the newer chain. Everything around it looked forgotten by time, yet the lock seemed decades newer than the surrounding structure. Someone had returned long after the resort's decline and deliberately sealed the area. The next morning, Ethan visited the town library. If the resort had a hidden section, there had to be some record of it somewhere. For hours, he searched through old newspapers, tourism brochures, and archived photographs. Most of the material focused on the resort's final years, when guest numbers had collapsed and owners changed repeatedly. Then he found something unusual. A tourism magazine from nearly 40 years earlier. The cover featured a crowded beach packed with visitors. At the center stood the very resort everyone now called worthless. Ethan flipped through the pages. The photographs showed smiling families, long reservation lines, and packed outdoor events. The place had once been one of the region's most popular destinations. But one image immediately caught his attention. In the background stood a large stone entrance built into a hillside. The same hillside where he had discovered the locked gate. He checked modern photographs. The entrance no longer existed. It had been hidden or sealed. His pulse quickened. Why erase something that had once appeared in promotional material? Before leaving, Ethan showed the image to the librarian, an elderly woman who had lived in town her entire life. The moment she saw the photograph, her expression changed. I haven't seen that place in years, she said quietly. You know what it is? Ethan asked. She hesitated. A lot of people used to visit there. What happened? The woman glanced around as if making sure nobody was listening. Most people don't talk about it anymore. Ethan leaned forward. Why? She folded the photograph and handed it back. Because after the old owner disappeared, that entire section of the resort was closed almost overnight. Ethan stared at her. Disappeared? The woman nodded slowly. Then she revealed one final detail. The man who vanished was the last person known to have the key to that gate. Ethan left the library with more questions than answers. The image of the hillside entrance and the librarian's warning replayed in his mind during the entire drive back to the resort. A missing owner? A sealed section of property. A hidden map. And a gate that someone had locked years later. None of it made sense. That evening, Ethan and Lily returned to the overgrown path carrying flashlights, gloves, and a few basic tools. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the abandoned section of land. The rusted gate stood exactly where they had left it. This time, Ethan examined the surrounding area more carefully. The fence connected to old stone walls that disappeared into dense vegetation. Several sections had collapsed over the years, creating gaps large enough to squeeze through. "Looks like we don't need the key after all," Lily said. Ethan smiled. "Maybe not." They carefully moved through one of the openings and followed what remained of an old pathway beyond the gate. The farther they walked, the stranger the area became. Nature had reclaimed nearly everything, but traces of human construction remained visible beneath the vines and brush. Stone benches lined parts of the trail. Decorative lantern posts stood tilted and broken. It looked less like a restricted utility area and more like a place that had once welcomed visitors. Then the path opened into a wide clearing. Both of them stopped. Directly ahead stood the remains of a massive stone terrace overlooking the coastline. Even in its ruined condition, the view was breathtaking. Waves rolled against untouched stretches of beach below. Cliffs curved around a sheltered bay hidden from the main resort grounds. It was one of the most beautiful locations Ethan had ever seen. "Why would anyone abandon this?" Lily whispered. Ethan wondered the same thing. As they explored the terrace, he noticed several weathered plaques built into the stonework. Most were unreadable. One, however, still contained enough lettering to decipher. It referred to the site as the Crystal Cove Experience. Neither Ethan nor Lily had ever heard of it. Yet, judging by the size of the terrace, it had once been a major attraction. Then Lily pointed toward the cliffside. "Dad, look!" Partially concealed behind thick vegetation was another structure. They pushed aside branches and vines until its shape became visible. It wasn't a building. It was a tunnel entrance carved directly into the rock. Above it, nearly hidden beneath decades of growth, were faded words etched into stone. Crystal Cove Springs. At that moment, Ethan realized the forgotten attraction wasn't a rumor or a legend. It had been real. And whatever existed inside that tunnel had once been important enough to draw thousands of visitors to the resort. Ethan stood frozen in front of the tunnel entrance. For a few seconds, neither he nor Lily spoke. The faded words carved into the stone seemed to belong to another era, one that had been intentionally erased from the resort's history. He brushed away more vines and dirt, revealing additional details around the entrance. Old ticket windows sat built into the rock wall. Nearby stood the remains of information boards that had long since faded beyond recognition. This had not been a small attraction. It had been a centerpiece. Something significant enough to bring visitors from far beyond the local area. The question was why it had disappeared. As darkness approached, Ethan decided not to enter the tunnel yet. The structure looked stable from the outside, but exploring an abandoned underground passage at night was too risky. Reluctantly, they returned to the resort. But the next morning, everything changed. A black luxury SUV pulled into the resort parking lot. Two men in expensive suits stepped out. Behind them emerged Victor Hale. The billionaire slowly surveyed the property before approaching Ethan with an unusually friendly smile. It was a very different expression from the one he wore at the auction. "I've been thinking about your little investment," Victor said. Ethan crossed his arms. "Really? I may have judged it too quickly." That answer immediately raised alarms. Victor Hale didn't visit abandoned properties because of curiosity. He visited them because of opportunity. After a brief conversation, Victor made an offer. A very generous offer. More than 20 times what Ethan had paid just weeks earlier. Lily's eyes widened. The number alone could solve every financial problem they faced. Yet Victor seemed less interested in the resort buildings than in one specific section of the property. The section near the cliffs. The section containing Crystal Cove Springs. When Ethan politely refused to sell, Victor's smile faded for the first time. The billionaire adjusted his jacket and looked directly at him. Some opportunities disappear if you wait too long. Then he returned to his vehicle and left. Watching the SUV vanish down the road, Ethan felt a chill run through him. Because Victor's visit had revealed something important. The billionaire knew exactly what Crystal Cove Springs was. And he wanted it badly enough to buy the entire resort. Victor's unexpected visit transformed everything. Before that day, Ethan had been chasing clues, hoping they might lead to something valuable. Now he had confirmation. A billionaire who owned luxury resorts across the country had personally driven hours to make an offer on a property he had publicly mocked just weeks earlier. That wasn't coincidence. That was desperation. The moment Victor left, Ethan returned to the tunnel entrance with renewed determination. This time he hired a structural engineer to inspect the area before entering. The report took several days and consumed money Ethan could barely spare. Meanwhile, new problems began appearing. A county inspector suddenly scheduled reviews of multiple resort buildings. Permit approvals that had previously moved forward without issue became delayed. Several contractors unexpectedly canceled agreements. Nothing was serious enough to stop the project outright. But together, the obstacles slowed everything down. Ethan couldn't prove it. Still, he suspected someone powerful was creating pressure behind the scenes. Fortunately, the engineer eventually delivered good news. The tunnel was stable. Not perfect, but safe enough for a limited exploration. A few days later, Ethan, Lily, and the engineer entered with flashlights. The passage stretched deep into the cliffside. Dust covered every surface. Old electrical fixtures hung from the walls. Signs pointed toward observation areas, viewing platforms, and mineral pools. The deeper they traveled, the more incredible the place became. This wasn't a simple tourist attraction. It was an underground natural wonder. Then they reached the main chamber. All three stopped. Even after decades of abandonment, the sight was breathtaking. Massive crystal formations reflected light in every direction. Clear mineral water flowed through natural stone pools. The entire cavern shimmered with colors that seemed almost unreal. Lily gasped. "It's beautiful." The engineer simply stood there speechless. Ethan understood why. No photograph could have prepared them for this. The place felt magical. As if nature had hidden a masterpiece beneath the resort all along. Over the following weeks, Ethan documented everything. Geologists, tourism consultants, and environmental experts visited the site. Their conclusions were remarkably similar. Crystal Cove Springs wasn't merely valuable. It was unique. Several experts described it as one of the most impressive undiscovered tourism attractions they had ever seen. Then came the report that changed Ethan's future. A major tourism development firm completed an independent assessment. According to their projections, if restored properly, the attraction could generate millions of dollars annually and draw visitors from around the world. When Ethan finished reading the report, he could hardly believe the numbers. But before he could celebrate, a certified legal notice arrived at the resort. Someone was challenging his ownership rights to the land surrounding Crystal Cove Springs. And the name attached to the filing made Ethan's stomach drop. Victor Hale. Ethan read the legal notice 3 times, hoping he had misunderstood it. He hadn't. Victor Hale was claiming that a decades-old property boundary agreement gave him rights to a portion of the land surrounding Crystal Cove Springs. The timing was impossible to ignore. For weeks, Victor had shown unusual interest in the resort. Now that experts had confirmed the attraction's enormous value, a legal challenge suddenly appeared. It felt less like a coincidence and more like a calculated move. The next month became a battle. Lawyers reviewed property records, old surveys, and ownership transfers dating back decades. Every document Ethan possessed was examined in detail. The stress was overwhelming. Money continued leaving his account faster than it entered. Some nights he barely slept. Yet whenever doubt crept in, Lily reminded him why he had started. "You didn't come this far just to quit," she told him one evening. Her words stayed with him. Then something unexpected happened. A journalist who had heard rumors about Crystal Cove Springs requested an interview. Ethan hesitated at first but eventually agreed. Within days, photographs and footage of the underground attraction appeared online. The response was immediate. Millions of people viewed the story. Travel websites shared it. Tourism experts discussed it. National media outlets picked it up. Suddenly, the forgotten resort that everyone had laughed at was becoming famous. Public interest exploded. Emails poured in from investors, travel companies, and potential partners. People wanted tours. They wanted reservations. They wanted access to Crystal Cove Springs. As attention grew, support for Ethan grew as well. The legal challenge that had once seemed intimidating now faced public scrutiny. Reporters began asking why a billionaire who mocked the property had become so determined to control it. The question spread quickly. And Victor Hale found himself answering uncomfortable inquiries. Then came the biggest surprise of all. After reviewing newly uncovered historical records, Ethan's legal team discovered a document nobody knew existed. A document signed by the resort's original owner. A document that could completely destroy Victor's claim. But before they could present it in court, an anonymous buyer submitted an offer for the resort. The amount was so large that every person in Ethan's office fell silent when they saw it. The offer sat on Ethan's desk like a challenge. He stared at the number for several minutes. It was more money than he had ever imagined possessing. Enough to eliminate every debt. Enough to secure Lily's future. Enough to walk away from every lawsuit, repair bill, and sleepless night. His attorneys encouraged him to consider it carefully. Financial advisors called it a life-changing opportunity. Even some of the contractors working on the resort quietly admitted they would accept the offer without hesitation. Yet something didn't feel right. The buyer's identity was hidden behind multiple companies and legal representatives. No one would say who was actually making the offer. But Ethan had a strong suspicion. Victor Hale. The billionaire couldn't win ownership through pressure or legal claims, so now someone was attempting to buy the prize directly. That evening, Ethan and Lily sat on the terrace overlooking the bay. The same terrace that had once been forgotten beneath years of overgrowth. Now survey teams moved across the property. Restoration crews worked in the distance. The resort no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. "You could sell it," Lily said softly. Ethan looked at her. "Would you want me to?" She thought for a moment. Then she shook her head. "Not if you'd regret it." The answer surprised him. Most children would have focused on the money. Lily focused on the dream. And in that moment, Ethan realized something important. This journey had stopped being about a financial investment months ago. It had become proof that believing in something others couldn't see sometimes mattered more than immediate rewards. The next morning, Ethan rejected the offer. News of the decision spread quickly. People were stunned. Many investors couldn't understand why anyone would refuse such a massive payout. But public support for Ethan continued growing. Then the court hearing finally arrived. For hours, lawyers argued over ownership records and historical agreements. Victor's legal team appeared confident. Until Ethan's attorneys introduced the newly discovered document. The courtroom fell silent. The original owner had clearly defined the property boundaries decades earlier. The language left almost no room for interpretation. When the judge reviewed the evidence, the outcome became obvious. Victor's claim collapsed. The challenge was dismissed. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed to capture reactions. For the first time since the auction, Ethan saw Victor Hale without confidence. The billionaire walked past cameras without answering questions. Meanwhile, another announcement made headlines. Reservations for the restored Crystal Cove Springs experience had sold out months in advance. And according to updated projections, the resort's value had already exceeded $45 million. The same property once mocked as worthless had become one of the most talked about destinations in the country. But Ethan's greatest reward wasn't the money. It was seeing Lily smile as they drove back to the resort they had saved together. The months that followed felt unreal. What had started as a forgotten property purchased for $12,000 was now attracting visitors, investors, and media attention from around the world. Every week brought new opportunities. Travel magazines featured Crystal Cove Springs on their covers. Tourism experts called it one of the most remarkable comeback stories in the industry. Yet one final chapter remained unfinished. An invitation arrived from the National Hospitality Excellence Awards, the most prestigious event in the hotel and tourism business. Ethan had been nominated for Entrepreneur of the Year. So had Victor Hale. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. On the night of the ceremony, the ballroom was packed with executives, investors, reporters, and business leaders. The same type of crowd that had laughed at Ethan months earlier. This time, however, the atmosphere was very different. People lined up to shake his hand. Photographers followed him across the room. Industry leaders wanted introductions. And beside him stood Lily, smiling proudly. When Victor entered the ballroom, conversations shifted. Some people greeted him politely, but the admiration he once commanded seemed diminished. For the first time, Ethan realized that success had changed more than his financial situation. It had changed how people viewed him. Midway through the evening, Victor approached their table. There was no audience around them. No cameras. No reporters. Just the three of them. Victor looked at Ethan for a long moment before speaking. "I underestimated you." The words sounded difficult for him to say. Then he presented one final offer. Not for the resort. For a partnership. A chance to combine their companies and expand Crystal Cove Springs internationally. The proposal was worth hundreds of millions. Victor extended his hand. Around them, the awards ceremony continued, unaware of the conversation taking place. Ethan looked at the billionaire's hand. Months ago, he would have accepted immediately. Now he wasn't so sure. Because for the first time in his life, he had something more valuable than money. He had the freedom to choose. And moments later, his name was called to the stage. The applause filled the ballroom as Ethan rose from his chair. For a brief moment, he stood still. Not because he was nervous. Because he was remembering. He remembered the laughter at the auction. The empty bank account. The broken resort. The nights spent wondering whether he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He remembered every person who had called the property worthless. And most of all, he remembered the little girl who had never stopped believing in him. As Ethan walked toward the stage, he glanced at Lily. She smiled and gave him a small nod. That simple gesture meant more than any award ever could. The presenter handed him the trophy as cameras flashed across the ballroom. The audience rose to their feet. A standing ovation. Months earlier, many of the same people had doubted him. Now they were celebrating him. When the applause finally settled, Ethan stepped to the microphone. He looked across the crowd. Executives. Investors. Industry leaders. Reporters. And among them, Victor Hale. For a moment, Ethan considered talking about business strategy, investments, or the incredible value of Crystal Cove Springs. Instead, he told the truth. 6 months ago, I bought a resort that nobody wanted. A few people laughed softly. The experts said it was worthless. The investors said it was hopeless. The numbers said I should walk away. The room grew quiet. But there was one person who never told me to quit. He looked directly at Lily. Emotion filled her eyes. My daughter believed in me when believing didn't make sense. The audience followed his gaze. Many smiled. Some wiped away tears. Ethan continued. People often think success comes from discovering hidden opportunities. But sometimes success comes from refusing to abandon something before you've given it a chance. The room erupted into applause again. After the ceremony ended, reporters surrounded him. Investors requested meetings. Business leaders offered partnerships. But Ethan politely declined most of them, including Victor's proposal. Not out of anger. Not out of pride. Simply because he wanted to build the future on his own terms. Over the following year, Crystal Cove Springs became one of the most successful destination resorts in the country. The resort created jobs, revitalized the local community, and brought new life to a town that had nearly been forgotten. Visitors traveled thousands of miles to experience the underground wonder hidden beneath the cliffs. And every tour ended with the same story. The story of a single dad who saw potential where everyone else saw failure. One evening, long after the crowds had gone home, Ethan and Lily stood on the restored terrace overlooking the bay. The sun dipped below the horizon as lights from the resort reflected across the water. It still feels unreal sometimes, Lily said. Ethan smiled. Me too. She looked toward the thriving resort below. What's next? Ethan laughed softly. Months earlier, that question would have terrified him. Now it excited him. He looked across the coastline, when new possibilities stretched far beyond the horizon. Whatever comes next, he said, we'll figure it out together. And for the first time since walking into that auction room, he knew with complete certainty that they would.